Hey, Ramsey, thank you for coming in today. You have just an incredible breadth in terms of your background, quite rare because you sit across so many different domains and you're executing very, very successfully. Definitely a superstar
Yeah, thank you,
in all
Stephen.
the
The,
things that you do.
the 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 joy is mine and the honor is mine. Thanks for having me. It's great to get to chat.
Well, again, I really appreciate you coming in and sharing your insights with the audience. I know they're going to get a lot of value. And my audience is very broad, by the way. There's like CEOs, technical directors, founders, scientists, sort of the gamut, right? So, I'm always curious when I meet incredibly successful people like you who are having this outstanding impact around the world and across so many different areas. What made you who you are today? What were the sort of the special magic moments? And it could have been when you were five, or maybe when in high school, it could, or in university, or maybe some of the first jobs you took on. But and I'm sure the list is endless. But if we could factor maybe the top two or three.
Yeah. Great question, by the way. When I think about, I would say like the transformational moments that I've been so fortunate to have, and it's with deep gratitude that I've gotten the opportunity to have each of these experiences. The first I would say is getting my PhD training from the world's greatest living neuroanatomist. And I'll tell you why that matters to someone who works in AI, because it kind of breaks the idea over your knee that intelligence is anything that's particularly human, as opposed to it's the property of an emergent complex adaptive system. And then I'd say the founding of my first company, Dopamine Labs, and our success building that, recognizing that not only was AI a tool that we were building, but in doing so, it was shaping us back. So it was our first behavioral engineering platform. And then I'd say speaking at a NATO Strategic Communications Summit on free will in the age of AI. So I suppose if I were to just say a brief thing about each of those as to why do those matter? Um, Neuroscience is a huge field. Not only is it being practiced by tens of thousands of people worldwide, so it's a massive international community, but it's an exceptionally broad study. You can study neuroscience and be a neuroscientist looking at genetics and epigenetics up to the scale of molecules we find in brain cells, the morphology of the brain cells themselves, the micro connections between small clusters of them, the meso connections between cell families, the macro connections between regions. And you keep zooming back and out and out. And eventually you're talking about behavior and the relationship between behavior and society. And now you're into psychiatry and psychology and sociology, all studying this thinking machine. And the level of detail that I studied as a computational neuroscientist at the University of Southern California was at the what we call the systems neuroscience level. So how do circuits of brain regions interact to drive goal-oriented motivated behavior, which is the end goal of what a nervous system is supposed to do. And doing that, I got to work with a man named Dr. Larry Swanson, who at the time was the president of the Society for Neuroscience, the secretary general of another exceptionally large international neuroscience organization. Um, Brilliant man, accomplished neuroanatomist, and a proponent of a model for thinking about the nervous system that breaks the idea that behavior and intelligence is a uniquely human property. We can talk about the most simple animals, Hydra and jellyfish, that are living creatures that are animals that have goal-oriented, adaptive, motivated behavioral states. And we can go all the way in complexity up to humans. And we can go past that and we can ask just abstractly, what is thinking and behavior made of? And how can we build a model that can descriptively and predictably talk about behavior as the emergent end phenomenon of complex adaptive systems? And that was a beautiful thing to start with in my career, because it set the course that when you want to talk about intelligence or motivation or behavior, you don't have to be anthropological about this, and you don't have to be anthropomorphic about this. We can talk generally about complex adaptive systems, and we can talk generally about what intelligence is made of. And that's become instrumental then in how, in my current venture leading the AI responsibility lab, we think about the coming future around things like synthetic labor, around what will the next generation of thinking things be, and is it okay that they don't look or think the way we do but still end up creating goal-oriented motivated behavior? That unlocking that part of my mind with him very early in my graduate program was probably one of those big like turning points in how I think about the world. second thing of building my first company, Dopamine Labs, was to see that not only could we build mathematical models that predicted how people would behave, but that by tweaking the digital environment around them, we could induce predictable new states of behavior. So, we were, the world's leading behavioral engineering firm for a little while, working on this problem at scale of how do you use technology to help people change their own behavior. And when we were able to demonstrate that in, random control trials, how our technology operated could induce meaningful, durable change in people's habits, this was really an aha moment for us, that this hypothesis we had that, sure, we can talk from the literature all we want about how the environment should shape our behavior, but it's not until you see 1,000 people around the world, dead strangers who are just numbers in a database to you, increase the frequency of a hard behavior like dieting or adhering to an exercise routine or driving more safely, that it really sinks in that, okay, the next part of the digital transformation here really is us looking at our own selves as parts of the digital landscape and then turning those affordances of engineering towards ourselves. And that was a bit of a wake-up call in some extents, because we also were building tools to help break tech addiction when the original waves of all the public concern around tech addiction started happening in the 2016, 2017 kind of timescale. So for us, getting to see that the tools we were building were in turn leaving their thumbprints back on humanity itself was a pretty pivotal moment for me. And I think that's a lot of what got me, in combination, I suppose, with the final milestone of speaking at a NATO summit about whether or not humans have free will in the age of AI, for which, it's a subtle answer that we have to tread very lightly on, because we're increasingly handing over lots of our autonomy for the amount of time we spend in digital contexts to stakeholders who may have interests poorly aligned with ours. A lot of that thinking is what got me then to where I am today, running the AI Responsibility Lab, recognizing that we have a very narrow time window that we're operating in right now, not just to figure out, like yourself, how do we use AI for good, but how does our use of data systems and synthetic intelligence align or fail to align with our notions of flourishing for individuals, for communities, for society itself? And what can be done to engineer the right tools and incentives to not just help that go well, but then help the companies who are at the front lines of deploying these technologies do so in a way that is both sustainable and extremely profitable for them. So realizing that these incentives have to meet everyone's needs. I think those three confluences, thinking about behavior as something that is not just human, recognizing that not only is AI not going away, but it is increasingly going to impinge upon our fundamental notions of humanity, and then recognizing that the international community was attending to this. Those, I think, are the three big things that stand out to me that have put me on the path that I'm on now.
I mean, there's so much to mine there. I mean, this idea that intelligence or even consciousness, or sort of expanding what you're mentioning, and how do you define it? How do you define self? How do you define the capabilities that humans have? And is that unique, or is that part of some bigger concept of which we're just one example? And then there's a myriad of examples. And I know in a prior conversation, I talked about, or we talked about corvids, these kind of species of birds, and their brain anatomy is different, and yet they can solve complex problems. Or we talked about octopus or octopi, and they have a distributed neural net, and it's different, but it works, right?
Yeah.
So, and you're right. This idea of really simple, or what we consider to be simple life forms, and yet they have tremendous problem-solving capabilities. Even a few years ago, these Japanese researchers had this sort of amoeba-like creature, and they put them in a silicon sort of a chip in a sense, but they stimulated it using light channels, and it could solve the traveling salesman problem. And the thing is, as you added variables to the traveling salesman problem, the time was scaling linearly. It wasn't exponentially, right? So,
Yeah.
and they're going, what's going on? Right?
Yeah, there's some local computation that it's doing that's breaking big O notation over its knee, saying like, nope, this is still within bounds. Like, we're going to be fine here. And they're looking at saying like, well, and any standard von Neumann architecture we have isn't going to do that.
Right.
And I think that is testament to this idea that we want purpose and dignity. We want to feel special in our place in the cosmos, and recognizing that we are a particular instantiation of a general pattern for building adaptive, complex systems that create purposeful, goal-oriented survival behavior of the individual and the species, that doesn't need to take away from our notions of dignity.
Right.
That you can get what exactly as you described a C. elegans with channel rhodopsin proteins stuck in it to solve computationally hard problems doesn't make you less special. If anything, it unravels a part of it pulls at the threads of the tapestry of life in the cosmos that shows that we are all more alike in very, very like practical and metaphysical ways than we probably let ourselves have common empathy for. And there is some beauty in coming to understand what we're made of. And I've never bought the answer that turning things into knowledge or science somehow de-beautifies them. I think it's quite the opposite.
You know, I'm part of this United Nations ITU. ITU is a UN agency, and they created this program called AI for Good and a global summit. We got 8 focus groups right now. They're even proposing another one behind the scenes, and of which I think it's probably a good idea. But on our second year, I opened the summit with Roger Penrose and his keynote, and then we did a Q&A with the audience. So I researched some of his latest work, and on the plane to Geneva, and I went through all of this work on microtubules and quantum gravity collapse, and that's sort of the instance of what creates consciousness, an instantiation of consciousness in human beings, and that really this is a property of the universe, and it's a law of the universe. Have you encountered that work, and what are your? I mean, it's definitely an outlier. There's a, so
Look,
what do you think about that?
everything is fringe science until it's not. Like, so you go back and so I know of what you're describing, and I've played with some of the ideas, and I'm going to only lovingly sidestep the question by like propping up some of the thinkers around the world wars. So you have Ludwig von Bertalanffy and Norbert Wiener, respectively, working out general systems theory and cybernetics. And at the time, we didn't know what to do with these ideas because they were too interdisciplinary. They weren't quite math, and they weren't quite physics, and they weren't quite computer science, and they weren't quite linguistics. And we didn't have the notion of like emergence science, and we're still mucking through it. Because after von Bertalanffy and Wiener and that cohort originally, von Neumann and everyone who's a participant in basically the wartime computing effort, the whole field of complexity science just split into subfields again. And I think one of the biggest trends we're seeing that as a young PhD student in the past decade, I got to see was that we are starting to get the reconvergence of exceptionally disparate fields of discourse and inquiry around there's something here that weather systems look kind of like neural systems, look kind of like stock markets, and we can think meaningfully about complex adaptivity as a domain to study. And all the ideas we encounter at the beginning of poking at that seem totally asinine, if not totally fringe at the beginning. It's only when we keep playing with them and they begin to have predictive power that we see that what we're actually just talking about is kind of a new kind of science, as opposed to something that is just totally out of left field. And so I'm never surprised when I encounter these new types of ideas, because a lot of the adventure of science is in its first stages, throwing stuff at the wall and trying to create new paradigms of explaining how these things that otherwise our old paradigms aren't explaining could possibly be. And so I've got a lot of patience for stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's like Fenwick and his work as well. That's this idea, and I don't want to quote him, but this is my interpretation of what he's saying. And we're a lens of this sort of bigger phenomena that's out there, the way our brains work, just like our eyes are like a lens of what the greater electromagnetic radiation is, of which we just see a tiny slice. So there's much more. Or an interesting conversation I had with John Hennessy, and we talked about the microbiome, right?
Yeah.
And the microbiome influences your cognitive ability,
It does.
metabolic disorders like type 2 diabetes. I mean, just the implications are everywhere, right? So, and this is kind of the system interaction that,
Yeah.
and
And that's why I love
effects.
that's why I love doing the computational neuroscience route, was that it encourages saying like, okay, let's bring in these kind of lateral components, because if you're going to try to explain at the end behavior of a complex adaptive emergent system, and you don't give yourself grace and the ability to like pull in complexity or adaptivity or emergence, you're never going to get an answer. Like you don't talk about behavior using molecules. You can't talk about behavior without talking about molecules. But like in terms of like necessity and sufficiency, we've got to be able to bring in these other ideas, and but then also treat them as we would rigorously treat everything else. Nothing is a pass. Just because you use the word quantum doesn't mean you get a pass on like testability or falsifiability or the burden of proof. So
when this interview gets published in a few days, we need to look at some of your work. So if we could include some links to some of your work, so that we can have a look at your thinking behind this. And I think it's really interesting and exciting. So let's follow up on that.
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be fun.
With our chief editor, so she can embed these into to the audience, make sure you look at Ramsey's profile as well, to look at all the links, so we can explore this further. You talk about this AI Responsibility Lab, and it's been a big topic, this idea of ethical frameworks and responsibilities and trying to operationalize it. You saw the European Union last year say, we're going to draft laws. But there's many countries doing that, or counties and things like that, including the US, where they're coming out and saying, we're going to try to regulate this in some way. And this is the way we're going to do it. Still early stage. So rather than the 300 frameworks and principles, taking it down so it's usable. On your AI Responsibility Lab, how can we use it? How can the community use your work in this area?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So we build enterprise grade coordination and project management software for data science teams. So here's what doesn't happen. What doesn't happen in the world's largest companies is that someone wakes up in the morning and says, I'm going to look at my calendar, and at 10 a.m. I've got a standing meeting, and at 10:30 I'm going to make some coffee, and at 11 I'm going to make a sexist algorithm. Like, that doesn't happen. No one wakes up in the morning and says, I'm just going to make the world a little worse using data. What does happen is that independent actors inside a company have coordination failures. There are lapses, unintentional lapses in communication, collaboration, centralization of information, standards, expectations, policies, incentives. And when you have more than a few people simultaneously trying to work in a data team, the default state is that a lot of things that you didn't really mean to have happen just kind of wobble apart. So you planned as a manager for this to go one way, and it just kind of doesn't, and it's no one in particular's fault. These are coordination failures. And when we looked at this problem, we saw that what a lot of the ethical AI and responsible AI community was talking about wasn't the problem, it was the end state. The end state of a data system that has outcomes that we would consider impinging upon our ethical norms and our like sense of right and wrong. That is a symptom. The problem upstream is you have no idea who's doing what data was used on which models are in what phases of the pipeline, what's in production and what isn't, whether or not anyone's tested them recently, and whether or not anyone's responsible for their end outcomes. That's a corporate problem. And if you want to solve that problem, you could look, in theory, at band-aiding things on the end and trying to certify and regulate, or you could solve it at the source and create software that makes it easier, faster, and cheaper for teams to get better visibility and coordination on how their teams are using data science. And that's what we make. That's this product we have called Mission Control. It is the missing dashboard for teams to move data science faster and break fewer things. And we see this not only as a way to make a meaningful inroads to this question of how do we operationalize responsible AI? How do we operationalize ethical AI? All right, look at how teams do data science. Build the missing tools that help them do that safer, better, and cheaper. And in doing so, you give civil society what it wants, which is a world defined by grace and dignity and flourishing, especially when it comes to our technology. But you actually also give engineering and data teams what they want, which is the ability to do cheap, fast, zero defect data science work. And when you triangulate those incentives properly, you see that everyone's actually on the same page. Like no one wants these negative outcomes. No one wants to be in the news as a company for an egregious failure of management of a data system. No one wants to be misidentified by computer vision, and no one wants to be automatically sentenced by an algorithm that has latent biases in it. No one wants their personal data chewed up and used and extracted from them as value. No one wants any of these things. And when you can help companies get right the parts that are hard for them to get right about how they coordinate, we reduce those negative outcomes. And companies get to adhere to their imperatives, which is to, deliver value for customers and shareholders while respecting the needs of the numerous now stakeholders at the table. So we view a lot of what we're doing as how do you practically implement some of the notions of stakeholder capitalism and this idea that firms are actually really responsive to and incentivized by a myriad team of different types of actors around them, ranging from, of course, regulators, but down to customers and the public. When we can take that and run with that, you end up with software that looks like ours. You end up with a tool that helps data science teams win and the world win at the same time. And that's that's what we're really proud of right now. And that's what we're taking to market right now.
That's really interesting. So, I mean, you're in the Southern California region, and I'm just in my mind, some companies come up like Alteryx has been around since the 1990s and the data side, and now they moved to AI and machine learning. I'm pretty sure this would be a prime interest to them. I can't speak for them. I'm just thinking they're in your region. Anthem would be as well, one of the top medical, I guess, insurance companies, but, they're very much in this area. I'm sure this would be a prime area that they'd want to talk to you about. I'm just thinking, and also, like the Alliance for Southern California Innovation has these really intimate conversations internally. I could see you being in sort of a center of that conversation. Have you advocated this idea within that community at all? And have you reached out to some of these companies? And then besides those companies in your area, have you talked with people like Alphabet or Google, Microsoft, IBM and others, that sort of the big tech people out there? Or you have Jensen, who just did his keynote yesterday at the GTC conference, and NVIDIA. And, this would be an area of interest as well. I mean, they got so many different people speaking in platforms, a lot of different sort of fragments, but are you sort of moving the needle with these different communities? And then I'll add the UN component to that, the academic communities. But let's start with sort of the business communities.
Business community. So, it's very early days for us, which is the most exciting part. We just closed a $2 million pre-seed round led by Stage Venture Partners here in Los Angeles, with participation from Royal Street Ventures and OCA Ventures, Protocol Labs, and Vibe Capital. So really grateful to our backers for helping us take this vision we have about a world that's defined by flourishing for people and machines alike, and then build and execute against it. But we are in that very early stage. So we are in touch with the Alliance for SoCal Innovation, good friends of ours. And as we look out at the landscape of the larger organizations out there who have not just the legacy data, but the institutional inertia around a lot of these problems, we know that we have to work with them, and they have to be a part of this greater way of thinking about the problem, because they're the ones who have the most to gain from thinking about this problem well, and the most to lose for pretending that this is not a thing that's going to have to be a strategic priority for them. Because as we're seeing it, every company is becoming a data company, and there's no way we can't not talk about that. Like, if we really are honest with ourselves about what we wanted out of computerization in the 80s and 90s and these early opening chapters of the digital transformation, it is easy for us to say things like, well, we're 30 years or so down the road from, Walmart's original push towards computerization. Look how far we've come. And I think with reflection, what we're seeing now is that as these companies have these legacy data systems that they're not just bringing online, but now bringing to life, leveraging using data science and machine learning, this is now where things become interesting. And it's in this sense that we see that we are still in the opening chapters of the digital transformation, that we have truly not seen anything yet in terms of exactly how radical and disruptive these shifts are going to be. And I use those words very carefully, not in the very blasé Californian technologist of, disrupt this, disrupt that, but in a very like traditional Joseph Schumpeter kind of just creative destruction way. things are going to look very different very quickly in a punctuated equilibrious position where we've been in a very steady state for quite a few decades in terms of our relationship between us and our technology. It is starting to change, and it will change in a like quantal level very fast. And we are really at that near takeoff point, I think. And it won't just be that the technology itself will become more sophisticated, but how civil society works, how we relate to ourselves, to each other, to the ecology, how these fundamentals of what it is to be a person, this is all what's on the table. And I think organizations like the United Nations understand this and have been thinking about this. I know that when you talk about Agenda 2030, there's some flack that was caught for it being very focused on some of the SDGs around innovation in industry and improving, at scale how we're leveraging these technologies. But you can't leave those parts out. We have to have those conversations. That has to be a sustainable development goal, because those forces are at play no matter what. And if an organization like that doesn't have their eye on it, it's unclear that the baseline incentive structures that exist create positive outcomes at a global scale without having that kind of voice in the room. So we need those kind of voices, because we really are still in the opening chapters of everything we are seeing with digital.
I see there's a fit here too. So, from an outreach standpoint, there's Doug Wilson. He's the chair and co-founder of the CEO Leadership Alliance, which is part of the Alliance for Southern California Innovation. They're headquartered out of Orange County, but they're building an AI center of excellence, right? So, so that would be probably a natural fit, at least to have an initial conversation to see if you can do something with them. And
that'd be cool.
They've got an upcoming event on March 24th, well, this week, on Workforce of the Future. So it may be worth looking at what they're doing there, because they're going to talk about their Alliance for, or I should say their Center of Excellence, the AI of Excellence. And they're looking at all of these different aspects as well. And it's a CEO-led organization, right? And they have a master fund called the Southern California Master Fund. So that's another area that's led by Dick Gautner as the chair. On the UN side, and we talked about this before in an earlier conversation, but the ITU has an innovation factory. It's an open platform. Anybody can apply, being the UN, right? So they facilitate. The thing is that it gives you the ability to expose what you're doing to a global audience. And the World Food Program is another one, which is the world's largest UN agency. I mean, by far, they're bigger than the one out in New York, which people sort of think that's the UN, but really they're somewhat independent bodies, right? The 40, let's say approximately 40 major UN agencies, and then the UN out of New York. And they have an innovation accelerator, open platform again, where you can apply. They have regular sessions in front of investors and governments and people. I'm part of these organizations, so I know. So, just to get the word out, I think you've already investigated Responsible AI Institute. I know you and I have talked about that. So
yeah.
I'm just thinking of ways to just get the word out, right? So, more and more people will adopt what you're doing, right? Or take a look at it.
Yeah. So, we're in that same position too, because, as much as this is exciting for us as a venture-backed software company, we understand what we're doing as part of the greater AI safety community.
Right.
And we view this on 3 time scales. It is appropriate today to be working as furiously as we can on the problems around AI ethics and sustainable AI, responsible AI. Put the word on it that you want, but it's how these relatively domain-specific, constrained uses of classifiers and regression and generative networks and the very practical tools we have in our toolkit of data scientists today, how those power business enablement in ways that minimize both waste and defective work for corporates, but also the civilization level and society level harms for people and communities. That's the very near term AI safety. That's today. That's one of the world's most pressing problems. We look 5 years down the road and we see what's coming in terms of synthetic labor and autonomous, non-sentient, but nevertheless still non-human labor actors. So things that can sign contracts, things that can purchase and buy and sell, things that have names and faces of humans that never existed, created by generative adversarial networks, and who predominantly operate on blockchain adjacent technologies that allow them to conduct economic transactions of their own accord. We view these things coming. We see the open source technologies that already exist that are a few years away from a proper combination at scale. And we see then these strong natural incentives for capital to flow towards these synthetic labor actors, and what that's going to mean in terms of increasing, gross world product, but at the same time, a substantial threat to human employment. And without being able to have sober conversations today about the imminence of synthetic labor and what can be done to create positive economic incentive structures for synthetic labor actors to adhere to human expectations of responsibility and discourse, we're going to find ourselves up a creek pretty fast. So we think of that as middle term AI safety, which is largely about permanent structural unemployment due to automation at scale. And then we think, of course, about the long term AI safety, which is much more the existential risk community. These are the fundamental, Nick Bostrom adjacent problems of control, alignment, and the fundamental theory of what happens when not just artificial general intelligence, but even a super intelligent agent is online, and where we go from there. And our organization is proposing that at least building around the periphery of that, if we can't solve some of the fundamental philosophical problems underneath alignment and control, we can at least start building smoke detectors, so to speak, that might give us a 6 month to 1 year head start on exactly how close to something like an intelligence takeoff we may be. So we look at these problems all as having a smooth, continuous narrative between them because they fundamentally all touch the same thing. We cannot stop any of this from happening, but we can carefully align incentives and tools and people to maximize our chances of the kinds of outcomes we're looking for. Ones that are good for people, good for companies, good for the technology. They give capital, humanity, and technology each what they independently want. And we don't have to pretend that they have to be zero-sum games. We fundamentally believe that at each time scale here, there are non-zero-sum intergenerational victories to be had. And we could not be more excited to be working in the space and these kinds of problems.
Yeah, I mean, it just occurred to me too, there's a group of 4,000 CEOs and government leaders that are part of I'm not sure if we discussed this before, but the Danish Management Society. They've taken on some of the big challenges, and they call it digital reshaping. So going beyond digital transformation, they really are post the fourth industrial revolution, which came out of the World Economic Forum, Smart Humanity, which came out of the Dutch IT Society in 2018, and the Society 5.0 came out of Japan roughly the same time, where it's sort of the impact everywhere. And they're implementing. So they brought in McKinsey to work with them, and so McKinsey has published a piece on how to transact in this area. They've done internal workshops and so on. I think they got something like 800 use cases. That's probably over 1,000 now.
That's exciting.
And they even have a dashboard and a free app so that CEOs can map how they're applying tech and to make sure it's done in a safe way. So very, very progressive. And I guess it kind of makes sense that it's headquartered out of Denmark, because they're so progressive in that sense. So I would say, you should reach out or try. I'm pretty sure they'd be receptive to what you're doing. And because they want to ingest anything that will safeguard the planet, and yet still can grow their companies and their societies and so on, right?
Well, I'm going to be speaking at Design Matters in Copenhagen in late September. So I will be in town, and we'll be talking about at this thing that it intersects responsibility and power decolonialization and deterritorialization. We're seeking to talk about what is the future of design in a post-human design era. And it's very much, a thing that's near and dear to our work is how do we think about what we need to know today to gracefully step into a world in which the majority of creative work in the next few years is not done by human actors, is guided by human actors, is done by pattern generating machinery that was trained on a corpus of previously human created work. But at the kind of scale that we're stepping into, I think this is going to be one of the most exciting times in the creative fields that's ever existed. But we have to have some interesting conversations at the lead about what we want out of that world and how do we step into it gracefully.
Are you working with the AAAI or ACM or IEEE and those kind of organizations? So AAAI is sort of the leading AI organization, and their new president, she's very sort of being on the ethical side, quite a famous scientist from IBM. And then ACM has been embedded in this for some time. IEEE, of course, they lead, they got their P7000, which is sort of the operationalization of what's going on. There's the ISO standards as well. So a lot of work going on there. I guess there's Singapore and the AI governance model. I mean, it's a bit old now, but they're continually progress. I mean, and the Oceanus and their open source stuff. Are you working with some of these bodies that are out there at all, or is it too early, and doing some outreach?
I mean, admittedly, we've got our first board meeting coming up in next week. It is a very young company, and as we're heads down on development of our core data science project management platform, we know that we still need to have our head up and out of the trench every now and then to get to meet these types of folks and work with these kinds of organizations. So we want to connect with them. We know it's on the roadmap because these are the organizations that are responsible for and that we charge with setting the course for how we're all going to think about these problems together. I mean, if we look back on why does the Western world work as well as it does, it's hard to talk about the invisible parts of your daily life that are defined by thousands of different ISO standards, without acknowledging that these organizations are so central to how we progress smoothly that we have to work with them at each step to make sure that as we're developing the next part of the state of the art and then implementing it at scale and operationalizing it, we have a good line of sight on like what our expectations are out of ourselves, but also each other, and what we can all agree upon how this must get done. So we're extremely excited to get to collaborate with teams like that.
Yeah, I guess the ITU, they're what, 160 years old, something like that. So they predate the UN. They are definitely the standards organization in many areas. In fact, Morse code, and the standardization of that was them, right?
That's so cool.
Or the area codes that you see, like in Canada, it's like 604 and things like that, or country codes. That's them. They're in the broadband and so on. They, this is a strong area of interest. I mentioned on the UN AI for Good program, they got focus groups, and they're open platforms. So you can just put your hand up and say, I want to join one of your focus groups, and then you have a voice. And because I've been involved with this since its inception, you get leadership by participating, right? And you have a voice in how this propagates globally. So, excuse me. So I'm just thinking that would be a natural,
It would.
It's just time, right?
Well, we've got something upcoming that we're really excited about. On May 19th in Cambridge in the UK, we'll be hosting a private one-day summit on AI safety and AI responsibility in association with Jesus College, Cambridge, to convene some technical and public sector leaders on what they're seeing in terms of the landscape around AI and data, what's working, what isn't, and convening 40 to 50 people in a single day under Chatham House rule. So no cameras, everything turned off, no live broadcast, things are allowed to leave the room, but no one's allowed to say who said what. To have a little more of an intimate discussion about like where are we going with this, and what can we do to continually ensure that we're course correcting in the direction we do want to go. So we're really grateful to our counterparts at Jesus College, Cambridge, to put on this day with us, and we're looking to fill a couple extra seats So for anyone who's in the audience and enjoying these conversations and feels like they or their organization wants to be part of the edge of how to win here in this space, we'd love to get in touch with them.
You know, it just reminds me again of UNESCO. So UNESCO a few years ago came out with a program to harmonize all of the operational and principles that are out there in AI, and they officially released their recommendations on AI, which has many sub programs, which and really to operationalize it. What I mean is make it useful so that companies and governments and so on can use it. And they officially got the member countries to support what they're doing. They have a research group called the International Research Center for AI, and they've been going out globally to find the top AI solutions. And in December, they released the top 100. And then in February at UN headquarters, they announced the top 10 out of the top 100. And they're continually looking at what's out there in the marketplace. Yeah, I'm thinking that reach out and see if they would participate in your event, because they're putting a tremendous amount of resources in this area. Yeah. I know on the top 10 that's just announced, there were only 2 from America. NASA was one, and Darwin AI was the other. That was
exciting.
It with
what an honor.
So, yeah, top 10, and that's across governments and businesses and startups and NGOs. It was blanket. Who are the top 10 in the world, right? So they would be a good group to have at your main meeting, right? So,
yeah, I think so. That'd be exciting. I'll have to reach out to them. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
So I want to know from you, based on not to flip the interview, but from your perspective, because you've been a leader in the space for some time, and you have a unique perspective of getting to know and see so much and so many people. What are the big trends that you're seeing around? Like, if you're to look around the corner, so to speak, or looking at the crystal ball, what is the thing that you're seeing that not enough people are talking about, or that we're not talking about often enough or loud enough in this space when it comes to things like AI safety?
There has been a turning point. So there's been discussion of things like the ethical aspects of technology, tech for good for, I don't know, ever since I was a kid. I mean, it was a young man, right? So, and then it was sort of in the periphery, because tech wasn't considered sort of mainstream. It was sort of like this sidle little group of people, but now it's integrated everywhere. And of course, AI is now integrated everywhere. It's moving from pilots and some centers within corporations, and it's proliferated scaling, right? Yeah. And you're going to see that rapid scaling in the next few years, because the realization to compete effectively, you have to scale it across the enterprise. It can't be just siloed in one pilot or so on, right?
And there's that lateral pressure. If your competition's doing it, now you have to do it just to stay in the same place.
Right. And then
complete Red Queen's race.
That's where what you're doing, though, is really the hub, because the impediment, the challenge right now is how can we do it safely, where it's not going to bite us in the future. And that's why I think this interview is so important, so that people are aware of what you're doing, and then they'll talk to you, right, and say, hey, we are scaling, but how can we do it in a way that it's going to uncover the areas that we don't even know about, right? So and really you're going to let them see around the corner. So that's the challenge right now. If you look at the MIT study, I think it was MIT and Databricks last year, where there's, you see the McKinsey and Deloitte and others predicting a 50% adoption, let's say right now, but and you see the World Economic Forum saying it's going to be over 80 in the next few years. But if you look to see how it's being used, small companies aren't using it readily, right? Because they don't know how. Medium-sized companies are adopting it, and also enterprises, but it's only in 12, 13, 14% across the enterprise. It's still really, really small niche. Yeah. And that's because of this fear, right? In my opinion, I think it's fear. How can we scale it? How can we get measurable value, but also address, this responsibility aspect which you're addressing? So I think again, you're at the center point. That's why I'm just sort of brainstorming where
Appreciate it.
you should
Also,
be talking to some key players out there, right? So
so there's a thing we've been seeing that we just started clicking in our minds in the past few weeks and really sinking in. In I came of age technically in the mid 90s, where if you wanted to learn how to program a computer, you'd go to a physical bookstore and you'd buy a For Dummies book. You'd buy Java for Dummies, second edition, and you'd teach yourself Java, presuming that you had an old beat up Mac at home and enough coffee to futz your way through the tutorials. And maybe if you were lucky, there was an example CD-ROM in the back. And that generation of autodidactic learners who picked up a book at a physical store with a floppy disk or a CD in the back and then taught themselves how to build, they occupy a particular place in the ecosystem right now.
right.
And then about 10 years ago was the boot camp revolution, where someone recognized there's an awful lot of people who picked an early career trajectory that wasn't serving them anymore, or they were interested in a career pivot, and enough of the technology around Web 2 is starting to commoditize that we could teach people full stack web application engineering relatively quickly and at scale and relatively easily, and using the same tools that we would teach them how to make. So you have this glut of labor born around 10 years ago that understands Ruby on Rails quite well, and JavaScript and cascading style sheets. And right now, that labor pool is fueling the explosion in enterprise SaaS that you see. So why is it that as Marc Andreessen says, software is eating the world, but particularly like web application based software for the enterprise is eating the world? Part of the causal mechanism there is that a decade ago, we started minting new experts in enterprise web SaaS like it was no one's business. 5 years ago, we kicked off the data science bootcamp revolution. And what's about to happen is we're about to have a labor glut of people who understand how to use TensorFlow or PyTorch, and they don't know what Ascom's Quartet is.
Right.
They have almost no data literacy.
Right.
They have not been trained in epistemology. They have not been trained in rigorous experimentation. And this isn't their fault. Like these aren't unintelligent people. This just isn't their background. Like they're not scientists per se. They are data technicians, and they will be trained in data techniques, and they'll be very good at optimizing the parameters in a classifier. If you ask them to pick apart or rederive the basic linear algebra that gets you there, they won't be able to do it. That wasn't what they were trained in the same way that someone who went through a coding boot camp to learn how to build a web app doesn't know big O notation, and they're not a computer scientist. That's okay. But these new men and women who are going to be this front line of entry level, high volume data science is going to get eaten by the enterprise overnight. Because to get from that 12, 13% to that 50 or that 80 is not just going to require the adoption of technology, it's going to require a ton of people who have at least some training in how to think with data. So what's going to happen is that the average age per capita of a data science team in 2024 is going to be average years of experience in data science is going to be much lower per capita in 2024 than it is today. Right now, data science teams are small and they're experts. They're about to be larger and less skilled because the labor demand for people who have these skills is going to be so high because of the ROI for the enterprise. So what this means is you're going to have more people around who know less. And that is the territory of coordination failure. That is a nightmare scenario, unless you have strong rails on the process. So when we look down the pipe, we see that every organization is about to have a data team. And per your description, it's not going to be siloed. It's going to be exceptionally interdepartmental. And that's what we're already starting to see in some of our enterprise conversations. But the complete need for the type of thing that we're building around project management, around data science, is about to become extremely pressing simply at the sheer intersection of number of people and average years of experience in field, and how the confluence of those two is about to hit.
Okay, so again, I'm sort of active brainstorming. This part isn't scripted, right? I'm just throwing out some ideas. So, Anaheim Union's high school district is one of the top in the U.S. Literally, they are so progressive. Mike Matsuda is a superintendent, and they've got a data science program embedded into their high school.
Crazy. Wow.
They've got one of the big tech companies supporting it. They're even exploring the metaverse. They got cybersecurity embedded in it. And because they're so high profile and so many people are looking at them as a national leader, um, and they're looking for partners. So, I see such a great fit between what they're doing and what you're doing. And there's a national lens on how they're progressing, right? So, and it's all the things that you mentioned, right? And again, on the CEO Leadership Alliance and the AI Center of Excellence, talent and talent growth across K to 12 universities and colleges, and what they call cascading mentorship program. That's a key feature what they're trying to do. And in other words, how do we bring the community along? Because there's there's a labor shortage in the specific skills, but rather than having peer and technicians or data scientists and people like that, everybody's going to have some fundamental background in some way. So how do you enable that, right? And if you look at some of the data from the big tech, they're saying a shortage of 50 million or some huge numbers, which can't be addressed, right? But you're trying to address that. So I'm just thinking then again, subject to the limitations of where you are and you're focusing on your mission control, your project management SaaS, then this could be just in the background thinking about it when you have the time to reach out. There's another gentleman by the name of Faizi Fetia who has a company called Corent. He's got some really interesting backers, and he's created a SaaS in a box. In other words, there's so much open source material out there, tens of thousands and things like that, but it's very, it can be very difficult to SaaS it. Software as a service can be sort of cumbersome and difficult. He's created a tool set and a mechanism so you can do it really quick and reduce the friction of doing it, right? And that's what he's doing with Corent. And if you look him up, he's very, very inclusive, and he chairs the CEO program group, and he's really well connected. But so you're talking about the SaaS elements, but that's democratizing where it's going to be easy, right?
Yes. Yeah.
But that ties into what you're saying as well. So I'm just thinking of some people to engage with or talk to, and then you're front and center with what you're doing as well.
Yeah, and we think that it's hard for us to imagine from our perspective going backwards here. Short of like everything going backwards, and we're not a degrowth team in the slightest. But we see the path forward necessarily involving this common component of taking care of the externalities our technology creates as like architectural to how we all succeed. And this is I think one of the big things that the proponents of stakeholder capitalism, I know that the WEF focuses on, which is if we're really interested in continuing to play the game that we're all playing here of how we're running this show, pretending that these things don't happen or couldn't happen is off the table. That's not an option. If you want to do good business, you have to do good business. And if you want to have a country or a society that flourishes, you have to take these things seriously because they're never going away. We're not one day going to wake up and decide, hey guys, we're kind of over data science. We're over it. Shut it down. I hate automation. This is terrible. I hate really high ROI. Like, nope, we're never doing this again. Like that conversation's never occurring. So we really have to come to terms with the fact that the way we move forward with this, especially in the next few years, is really going to set the tone for the decades to come. So we have a very narrow opportunity, we think, to not just do good against these missions, but to demonstrate that these are the high profit, high alpha routes to go, because the alternatives are anything from wasteful to harmful. And we just don't have time, bandwidth, or resources for that.
It's such an interesting conversation. I could spend days with you because you've got this unrelenting dedication for intergenerational and civilization level non-zero sum wins for ecosystems, for humanity, and it goes beyond humanity. It's really everything because everything's interconnected. And I can see why, that's interconnected with capital and beyond technology. It's really every domain. I can see why your ideas are on 60 Minutes and Time Magazine and with NATO and BBC and GQ and so on. You're sort of tying together all of these desperate pieces, which are often exist in silos, but you have the ability to bring them all together in a kind of cohesive way that makes sense. So these are sort of the final list of questions. What's the next book, or what's the next major community event you're going to do? Where do you want it? And then beyond that, where do you want to see what you're doing in the next 3 to 5 years from a professional standpoint and a personal standpoint? And then I'll end with another question, and we could take this in pieces. What's your final message to the audience? What's the call to action to my audience?
Okay, we'll start with the call to action, because that's the fast and easy one. If you are a leader of a company, a data science team, a team that's using data, if you are a civil servant, if you are at the helm of an organization that is part of this transformation, you are a steward of how your company or your society or how your team is using data. And we are here to support that process and give you the ability to move faster and break fewer things. So you can see what we're working on at takecontrol.ai or at airesponsibilitylab.com. You can find me on LinkedIn. We want to meet folks like yourself. We want to hear about how things are working or aren't, and see how what we have in our development pipeline meets the needs and the pains that you are seeing around how we're doing this transformation together, because there's so much upside to doing this right, not just for society writ large and the world writ large, but for your team and for your bottom line. So that's the CTA, I suppose. As far as where we want to take this, of course, we've got our summit with Cambridge on May 19th. And, as I said, we're looking for another couple faces to join us in that conversation in person in the UK. It's going to be a very special day. We are looking forward then to later in the year getting to set down our initial white paper for the Synthetic Labor Incentive Protocol, which is our conceptual space idea here around what do we need to build, the big we, what needs to be built to increase the likelihood that as we begin to work with synthetic labor agents in the 2027 timescale, we are prepared to do so in a way that can simultaneously increase the probability that the synthetic labor agents we work alongside are regulatable, and we can test and prove that they are made of components we would consider ethical or responsible, whether those are data sets, models, or other technologies. And at the same time, in creating that security protocol, bootstrap a liquidity pool against it that can be used as the basis of a universal basic income project, because we will simultaneously want safe synthetic labor and the ability to offset the losses in livelihoods created by the rise of synthetic labor. And if you connect these two things, which I think there's a natural connection that I see, you end up getting something like a currency that is pegged to the supply of synthetic labor. And that's one of the most exciting projects in the world, we think. So we're looking forward to releasing our initial white paper on that. There's currently a draft of a proposal going around that I gave to you that I'd encourage you to give to interested parties. And beyond that, as we look at not only how our team has to grow of the AI Responsibility Lab, getting to work with the leading companies, investors, and smartest people in the room on the world's second largest problem, we're excited for the growth in the space. We see that AI safety is really rapidly moving from a consideration that is exceptionally academic to one that is exceptionally practical. It is going to become one of the dominant narratives in the world over the next decade of what do we do about machines that think. And as more and more people's daily lives, as their businesses, as their lines of capital and their efficiencies and their productivity are touched by this transformation, how we go about this with grace and dignity is going to become one of the dominant conversations of the day. We're very excited to have a voice in that conversation, and we're excited to meet the other people and teams and actors in this space to make sure we're all on the same page and that we're able to meaningfully bridge not just our differences in little micro perspectives, but our time scales between the ethics community, the labor community, and the long-term existential risk community. We're all on the same team and we're all talking about the same thing. So I'm excited to see those conversations starting to merge. That's one of our topics at the summit with Jesus College Cambridge this May, is how we think about merging those timelines, because it's going to be unacceptable that those that care strongly about community level harms by data science aren't talking to the people who care strongly about survival of humanity. These are the same teams. These are the same goals. And we're all after the same relationship with our machines, is that of mutual flourishing. I understand and can respect the differences in lived experiences and contexts that get us to understand what do they want and what do I want and why are these different. But we have to start looking for bridges. We have to start looking for those common places. And when we find those, I think we're going to be in a much safer and more profitable place than we are even today.
And then personally, where do you want to see yourself in, let's say, 3 to 5 years?
Santa Barbara. That sounds nice. It's beautiful. There's good surf. It's good winds. Keep a boat there. No, I mean, I live here in Los Angeles with my co-founder, and we've got a team distributed across California. I'm looking to grow that. Personally, I'm looking forward to actually getting to spend a little bit more time on the European continent, with teams like the ones that you're a part of, and some of our customers are very European centric. And so I'm looking at getting to explore Lisbon a little in the coming months. I hear it's absolutely stunning. And I'm looking forward to getting to learn and grow in this adventure too. And, as a young CEO, this is a very exciting time for me to be in the space. I'm exceptionally grateful for those who have placed not only their trust in me, but for the outstanding opportunities I've had along the way to get here. And to find how to transmute that opportunity of a combination of just incredible fortune and durability of spirit into something that gets to leave an outsized impact for everybody, which is, I think, the only thing one gets to do with a life like lived like that is you have to find that thing that is the hardest thing you can work on, that has the biggest impact on the most amount of people's flourishing, and then dedicate yourself to it with complete dogmatic ferocity.
In our conversation, just one final comment, and then I'll do a quick sort of summary and thank you. But and I'm not sure if I mentioned this, so Mylene Fung, the People-Centered Internet. Yeah. You so definitely need to connect with her and Tamara Singh. They're doing a lot of open work. It's like 100% alignment, right?
Yeah.
And their background is just tremendous, right? Both of them. So I just want to just make that last comment and get it out in the public too, because I think there's just so many different forces, and if you collaborate, there's like force multipliers, right? So but in my closing comment, I just want to thank you. I mean, you are brilliant, and you're gracious, and you're doing so much just amazing, outstanding work, and looking at this in a very holistic but also in a granular way. And it's a combination of the two is very difficult. And then you're executing as well, which is really important. And you created a platform which can be consumed by enterprises, right? And used in useful ways. So definitely ahead of the game and in alignment where everything is growing. And thank you so much for coming in and sharing your deep wisdom and insights with our audience.
Stephen, thank you. It's an honor to get to speak with you like this. It's an honor to get to meet your audience, and I hope to connect with them. I'm easy to reach. I'm Ramsay, RAMSAY, at AIResponsibilitylab.com. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm sure we'll throw my bio up there and in the description of the video. Excited to meet anyone who thinks that what we've discussed today resonates, whether they're in the public sector or the private sector, and they're looking to figure out how does my organization win with this, and what do we need to move faster and break fewer things. I want to talk with you about that. So Stephen, really grateful. Thanks so much for the opportunity, and looking forward to connecting next.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website, www.tbcy.in, to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.